faint and quiet then, so I hope you can still be heard all right.
Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Ali's just started the recording, so I am going to start because we've hit 10 o'clock now. So thank you very much for joining. Welcome to this series on wet woody habitat webinars. I'm Emma Deer, and I'm hosting this series of webinars on behalf of the Tree Action Plan Delivery Team in Natural England. And we've put this together with colleagues from Forestry Commission, Forest Research and the Environment Agency. So by way of introduction, my team gives advice on woody habitat creation schemes to ensure that the trees are planned for the best possible location without compromising other nature recovery. Dan, could you hit the next slide, please? So here's some quick housekeeping rules for the webinars. They're all being recorded. They'll be stored alongside of a PDF of the slides and a collection of recommended follow-up resources. We do recommend that you listen to them in order if at all possible, but you can always catch up with the recordings later if you can't join live. Please do put questions in the chat, but hold on to them until the question section at the end. And so we won't be taking questions during the talks. Next slide, please. And as you may already hopefully know, this is a series of webinars which is designed to help us to understand the importance of wet woody habitat. And Dan Abrahams, who's leading the first webinar, will introduce the wet woody habitat. And we're also delighted to welcome Gareth Fisher from RSPB, who's going to outline a couple of case studies. So in the next couple of weeks, we will move on to how wet woody habitats work, why we want and need wet woody habitats, and finally, making wet woody habitats happen, what you'll need to understand in terms of regulations and plannings for new wet woody habitat creation to be successful. And we appreciate that we can't cover everything in these webinars, but we hope that there's a strong framework covering the key issues that you should consider with pointers about where you can find more information. So hopefully you're filling in the poll that's appeared up on your screen. And I can't see the screen because the poll's on it. So I'm just going to click submit so that that moves out of my way. Dan, can I have the next slide, please? So TAP-D works towards 6 principles of ecological principles for woodland creation. And one of those is around increasing the potential for wet woodland. And this webinar series was initially designed as a learning tool for the team. However, Natural England staff also have to deal with wet woodland on our protected site series and catchment sensitive farming and in nature recovery. But also, while bringing the leading experts from Forestry Commission, Forest Research and Environment Agency, it also highlighted to us that this subject is actually relevant across our different organisations. So it's great to have this webinar series shared across the organisations, and welcome to everybody. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Dan. Dan Abrahams, Natural England's woodland, not just wet woodlands, woodlands senior specialist. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Emma. Thanks for that. Nice to see everybody. So thanks for joining this. Yeah, I've got the unenviable task of setting the scene for the next 3 webinars, really. So if it all goes pear-shaped, it's my fault. So yeah, hi everybody. I'm Dan Abrahams, Senior Specialist for Wooded Habitats with Natural England. I'm going to give an introduction to what we mean by wet wooded habitats. I think because although woodland cover in England has ebbed and flowed over history, and we've lost or damaged a lot of our ancient woods, we actually have much more woodland cover now than we did certainly 100 years ago, and perhaps as much as we've ever had over the last sort of like 400 years, really. But wet woodlands in particular have been almost completely removed from our landscapes, really. And we've not only lost the woods themselves, but we've also lost any cultural memory of having large-scale wet woodland landscapes in England, and the importance that they have for biodiversity and for humans as well. And we're going to be returning to these themes over the next few weeks, if you stay with us. I'm going to return to the point about, you know, what we lost along the way in a little bit, and also what we could do to restore England's landscapes and the benefits that might bring. So this series of webinars is really all about raising awareness of wet woody habitats, and also to get us thinking more about how and where we might start to rebuild wet woodlands at scale. So I'm going to talk about what wet woody habitats are, their key characteristics, the biodiversity they support, which will be expanded on in future webinars over the next few weeks. And as Emma said, you know, we're also going to hear from Gareth from the RSPB with practical examples of their attempts at restoring hydrology to woodlands within their ownership. So that's really a sort of, you know, précis of what we're going to be talking at over the next couple of hours, really. Excuse me. So, wet woodlands, or wet woody habitats, unsurprisingly, are those found on wet or seasonally wet soils. We're using the term wet woody habitats to encompass that range of vegetation that we might expect to see, including wet scrub, as well as more mature woodlands as well, and everything in between. I'm probably going to be using those terms interchangeably throughout this talk, so just be aware that I'm talking about that range of woody habitats. So although we're grouping them together, these habitats can be very variable, and they're influenced by a range of factors. So although, you know, wet woodlands can be loosely grouped through systems such as the National Vegetation Classification, the NVC, there is a great deal of diversity both between and within these woodland types, largely dictated by variations in wetness, canopy density, the soil type, so mineral versus peat, the pH of soil and water, and nutrient availability, as well as geography and their position in the landscape. So, you know, lowland versus upland, etc. So, you know, these habitats, you know, they can be some of our most structurally diverse and dynamic habitats. And you can see, if you look at the real tangled mess on the right-hand photograph, you know, there's a real, you know, variation of structure going on with, you know, trees falling over because of the wet ground, lots of layering of vegetation. So they are really, really interesting from a biodiversity point of view. However, you know, the patches of habitats that we have are now generally restricted to small parts of larger woodland complexes, or they're individually small and isolated and in poor condition. So, you know, this is often due to issues like drainage, abstraction, eutrophication. So water supply, both water supply and water quality, can often be compromised on these sites. Most of the remaining wet woodlands, even ancient woodlands, have been drained to some extent, just like the rest of the surrounding landscape. And even our drier woodlands would have been, you know, much wetter in the past. So it's not just wet woodlands that we're concerned with per se, but also thinking about how we might restore hydrology to drier woods where this is appropriate. And Gareth will be talking about that in some detail later on. Okay, so I mentioned the NVC earlier. So the NVC, which is, you know, National Classification System for Habitats, describes 7 types of wet woodland found in Britain, 3 types of willow woodland, 1 birch woodland, and 3 alder woodlands. So those are those there. So W1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's easy to remember. They're the first ones. So obviously the best. I'm going to show some slides of these different types in a moment, just so that you get a general understanding of the sort of like the difference and variation, really. But before we get to that, I think it's important to just run through some the relationships really between different terminologies. So this is a little bit of a complex slide, but I'll try and explain it as best I can. So we have those 7 MVC woodland communities across the bottom, W1 to W7, some of which are found on almost exclusively on peaty soils. Those are the ones in red, and others on mineral soils. And all of these collectively are considered part of the wet woodland priority habitat. So they all sit under that umbrella, if you like. And then also sitting under that umbrella, we have these 2 types of Annex 1 habitats. So for those who don't know, Annex 1 habitats are habitats of European importance, described in the Habitats Directive. They are habitats that we can designate special areas of conservation for, SACs. And there are 2 which we're concerned with here, so bog woodland and alluvial forests. So, you know, they're still wet woodlands, just a special type, I guess. And bog woodland tends to sit in the sort of like W3 and W4 woodland categories. So it's wet woodland on peat, as you might expect, with it being bog woodland. And alluvial forests tend to conform to the W5, 6, 7 classifications on both peat and mineral soils. So that's how that all sits together, really. So that might sound a little bit complicated, but if you work in the uplands, you might only be concerned with a few wet woodland types. Or if you work in the lowlands where there's not very much peat around, like, I don't know, Oxfordshire, I guess, then you only really need to think about a couple of those. So I just thought I'd set that out at the start, just so there's a general understanding about that. Okay, so I'm just going to talk through these different woodland types very briefly, starting with those that are found on peaty soils. So you don't need to memorize all of this, but I think it is important to have just a general picture in your mind and understanding of the range of woodland types, and also that different types might occur in different landscape contexts. So the grey willow, downy birch, common reed woodland type is generally a lowland habitat, characteristic of places like the Norfolk Broads, Cheshire meres and mosses, etc. So it's found on mires and around water bodies generally. I talked earlier about variation within woodland types, and this is a good example, actually. So here, you know, this is all the same woodland type, although different sub-communities. So there is variation within woodland types. So the picture on the left is dominated by sphagnum mosses, and the one on the right by common reed. So, you know, not only is there that variability between woodland types, but also considerable variation within woodland types as well. So I think it's an important point to drive home, really. The bay willow bottle sedge woodland is very much a northern woodland type, so found in Cumbria, North Yorkshire, Northumberland, those sorts of places. Many of the species found in this community are plants of cooler, more northerly distribution, including the main tree species itself, bay willow. So it's, you know, it's very much found in geographically different situations to the previous type. Some pictures there. And then the downy birch purple moorgrass community is much more widespread, both across the lowlands and uplands, but usually on the thinner peats on the margins of bogs and mires. It's almost always dominated by birch in quite open conditions, such as this, with the trees being, quite spaced out. And purple moorgrass is pretty much always very abundant in the ground layer. Just a little landscape context for you. The W5 alder greater tussock sedge is found principally in the lowlands on peat, so there's usually a great abundance of alder in the canopy, with greater tussock sedge being really conspicuous in the ground layer. And I think for woodland MVC communities, there's sometimes quite a bit of mystery about it being an arcane art, but really at its sort of like face value, it's really thinking about what are the main tree species that are growing here, and and what's conspicuous about the ground flora, and that's usually a good measure of what sort of MVC type you're looking at, really. So it doesn't have to be intensely complicated. It can, once you get your eye in for these communities, it can be quite simple, really. And there you can just see the dominance of the tussock sedge, which is very characteristic of these types of woodlands. So that's the peaty communities done. And then we have 3 woodland communities on more mineral soils generally. So grey willow marsh bedstraw woodland is pretty widespread in the lowlands, particularly around the fringes of open waters or slow moving watercourses. The W6 woodland, alder stinging nettle, is generally found in more enriched soils, most commonly associated with river valleys, but also around open waters. It's often considered a degraded woodland type through drying or drainage or agricultural intensification, but it can be the result of naturally deposited silt in slacker parts of river valleys. So it is quite a common woodland type. And then finally, we come to the end of our set of woodland types. W7 alder ash woodland, which is generally found in upland river valleys and on flushed slopes. Again, it's more of a northern woodland type, although not exclusively in this case. But it can often be found actually further away from watercourses, where there's groundwater percolating from springs, etc. So that's our MVC communities, really. I'll just talk a little bit about those Annex 1 types. So bog woodland, I mentioned, was one of these Annex 1 habitat types. In England, it is a bit of a misnomer in the fact that it appears to exclusively be found on mires, where obviously the water is supplied through springs or watercourses rather than through rainfall. So it's found on mires rather than bogs, really. And much of the habitat is found in the New Forest. So this is some pictures from the New Forest. I think in total, the estimate is that there's probably no more than 200 hectares of this in England. So, very rare and sort of localized to certain areas of the country, really. The other Annex 1 habitat type I was going to talk about is the alluvial woodland, alluvial forest. Although what we have left in England is really residual habitat rather than intact floodplain woodland, which would have been the natural vegetation cover of most floodplains. As a habitat type, it's been almost entirely lost from England through, clearance for agriculture many centuries ago, really. As a result, floodplain woodlands are not adequately described in the MVC, as they no longer exist on any significant scale. So this is the more common picture we see next to our watercourses on the floodplain. Should just make the point that we do have riparian woodland. So riparian woodland, i.e., woodland immediately adjacent to rivers, it's not the same as alluvial woodland. And although, it is valuable as a habitat in its own right and as a buffer between watercourses and agriculture, etc., it's no substitute for fully functioning alluvial woodland, which is connected to the river hydrologically and allowed to flood, creating an ever-changing mosaic of open water, wetland and woodland habitats. So we're going to be returning to that topic of floodplain woodland a bit later on. But I just thought I'd set out those sort of key features at this point. Okay, so we've got all these woodland communities that we have to play with. So when it comes to landscape scale restoration, of course, we want to see a diversity of wooded habitats. That's a given, really. This slide it's a great graphic by National Trust of an idealized upland landscape. It's in their wood pasture systems toolkit. I think Emma's going to provide some links to some of these documents in the chat, so you can go and peruse them at your own will after the webinar. But here, we can illustrate how different woodland types might occupy different spaces in the landscape. So, we may have sort of like older woodland on those flushed slopes, and then as we come down the valley, we might see that grading into older willow and birch woodland closer to the river, and then again on around slacker areas of water, whether that's open water bodies or oxbows, we might see more of that sort of characteristic willow habitat developing. And then finally, in more peaty areas, we might see the sort of like more characteristic bog woodland communities occur as well. So obviously this is a completely fictitious example, but I think it is a useful tool just to illustrate how these different woodland types might present themselves in a landscape context. And I think it's probably particularly important when you're thinking about creation of wet woodland habitats and the underlying hydrological processes, etc., soil type and all that sort of stuff. So there's already a lot of tools which help us with that, such as the ESC tool developed by Forest Commission and various other things. So just thought it might be useful to just sort of like present that in a sort of infographic, really. Okay, so in 2023, so a couple of years ago now, Natural England produced the Favourable Conservation Status definition for wet woodland. Favourable conservation status is the point at which we can say the habitat is thriving, essentially. So the definition estimated that we have around 78,000 hectares of wet woodland in England. That was based on data derived from the NFI, the National Forest Inventory, developed by Forest Research. And it's expected that that is almost entirely found in small patches. So, you know, a relatively restricted area in very small patches, sort of like less than 2 to 5 hectares generally. The definition also stated that we think we need another 53,000 hectares to meet favourable conservation status. So that's obviously a very big ask. And it really sets the ambition for delivering new wet woody habitats at a large scale. So I think that's probably best developed through creating the right conditions for buffering and extending existing patches of habitat. So where we do have wet woodland, then obviously we need to hold on to it. We need to restore its condition, and we also need to increase its area. So, you know, one of the issues that we have is that we don't really have a good handle on where our wet woodland is. We don't have it mapped adequately, and that really constrains our ability to plan for restoration and creation. But it is one of the evidence gaps that Natural England is hoping to bridge through more detailed mapping of all of our woodland priority habitats over the next few years. So that's a piece of work that I'm involved in. I've been talking to Forest Research about how we take that forward, really. So hopefully we will have a better, much higher granularity on where our woodland priority habitats are, which will then help us to plan a lot better. So I'm going to talk about the biodiversity of wet woodlands, which is one of the things I'm most interested in. So wet woodlands, as a specific subset of woodland habitats, they do support a particular biodiversity which may not be replicated within drier woodlands, which obviously, you know, may have been drained in the past. And I think perhaps in part due to their inaccessibility to heavy machinery, many wet woodlands are generally unmanaged, and as a result are subject to a series of natural processes which over time can produce complex vegetation structures, lots of trees lying on other trees, varied topography, abundant decaying wood, and so on, really. And so they are really diverse habitats. And although there are a few vascular plants that are entirely dependent upon wet woodlands, generally the ground flora of wet woodlands is botanically more diverse than that of drier types. Wet woodlands often form a very small proportion of larger woodland complexes, but even so, the botanical richness of a wood can depend largely on how much wet woodland there is there. And if we look at species recorded in the MVC, so across all woodland communities, there's about 500 species recorded there. And 129 of these, so, you know, more than a quarter, were recorded exclusively in those wet woodland communities. So, you know, they do have a very specific role in providing that sort of like greater diversity. And that diversity is really characterized by, you know, the conspicuous presence of bryophytes, mosses and liverworts, tall herbs, sedges, ferns, horsetails, as well as, you know, several tree species, principally willow species. So, you know, it's all, as you might expect, it's all that sort of like wet stuff which comes with wet woodlands, really. But it's not just plants, of course. So wet woodlands also have a very specific invertebrate fauna. And a large number of invertebrates are associated with those main canopy tree species, so principally alder, willows, birches. So a lot of these are second only to oak in terms of the species that they support. But that can be true of other drier native woodlands, of course. But however, in addition to that, wet woodlands bring with them a host of habitat features such as flushes, seepages, log jams, submerged and wet decaying wood, and those all provide opportunities for many other species. So a lot of crane fly species, some of which are very rare now, are associated with seepages in woodlands. And the species at the bottom there is the log jammer hoverfly, which is red databook species, which lives basically most of its life cycle in or around decaying wood in streams, really. So as its name suggests, so very specific and distinct invertebrate fauna. So we talked about woodland seepages. So seepages really are just very small watercourses which sort of like percolate through vegetation. Woodland seepages are the richest of all of those seepage habitats. About 170 key invertebrate species have been identified that show a strong fidelity to these sort of like microhabitats. 53 red databook species, 10 are included as UK BAP species, and 3 are also Annex 2 species of European importance. So really important to have this sort of like wet stuff in woods, which is providing lots of benefits for lots of different species. And as mentioned previously, the dead wood that we find within this woodland type can be very diverse and abundant. Its association with water provides specialized habitats which are not easily replicated in drier woodlands. And these wet logs can arrest the decay of fallen trees and branches, prolonging the habitat continuity for many of these invertebrates that depend upon them, really. So yeah, about 150 species have been found to be associated with coarse woody debris. Again, several red databook species, many of them being these rare crane flies. So yeah, really important for invertebrates, but not just those. If we think about birds, so willow tit is perhaps one of the birds most associated with wet woodland. Its decline has been well documented, 94% since the 70s. It often occurs in dense, wet scrub and nests quite close to the ground. It's quite fussy in the fact that it's quite a sedentary species, so it doesn't like to move very far, and as a result, quite vulnerable to nest predators such as great spotted woodpecker. It can also be outcompeted by other hole nesting tits, so blue tit in particular will steal willow tit nest holes, and they like to create their own nest hole every year rather than using existing ones, which is obviously a very long and exhausting excavation process. And if they lose that nest site or brood, then a pair may not have the time or energy to attempt a second brood. So there's some real issues with willow tit, really. But if we can provide suitable habitat for them, then obviously that's going to go some way to mitigating their decline. And then, of course, we have our furry friends. So we think of beavers as being like the poster child for wet woodlands, and their engineering prowess has been very well documented, and they can deliver lots of benefits for a wide range of biodiversity. They can alter wetland habitats, both in subtle ways, but also quite radically in some circumstances, depending on the situation. But I don't think we should rely on them entirely to deliver all of the restoration that we need. We still need to think about restoring a more natural hydrology and also restoring water quality to our wetlands as well. And beavers don't necessarily need a lot of woodland, surprisingly. They can exist in intensive agricultural landscapes as well. Here we can see maize dams being constructed in watercourses, with the beavers pulling the maize out of the arable fields, tracking down the bank and then placing them in the river. So it's not just woody vegetation that they're utilising. And there's one of those maize dams which has been constructed. So across a range of groups, range of taxa, really, the biodiversity of wet woodlands or wet woody habitats can be very rich. And there are other ecosystem benefits provided by these habitats, which I'm not going to talk about in any detail because they're going to be covered in one of the later webinars. So you're going to have to wait for that. But it's things such as water quality, drought mitigation, flood alleviation, etc., and probably many other benefits as well, which they can provide. But we'll obviously touch on that later on. Okay, so just moving on, switching tack a little bit. I'm going to talk about, I said I'd return to floodplain woodland, because what we really want is to restore wet woodlands at scale to our landscapes, which in a very crowded island like the UK can be quite difficult. But I talked a little about floodplain woodland and the fact that wet woodlands were once much larger and widespread, especially on floodplains. But what are the opportunities for creating floodplain woodland? How realistic a proposition is it? So here is a map of two areas of the River Trent, so one of the major rivers in the UK. This is just northeast of, so the map on the left is just northeast of Nottingham. You can just see the urban conurbation of Nottingham there. And the map on the right is a bit further north, so that's north of Newark. So as you can see, there is woodland within the Trent floodplain. So the blue hashed area is the indicative floodplain. Although that woodland is pretty sparse and fragmented. So in fact, the woodland cover in the Trent floodplain there accounts to less than 1% land cover. So I'm just going to give Emma a heads up. So this is the audience participation section. So there's no such thing as a free ride. I just want people to just stick in the chat. In a minute, I'm just going to put up a map of the ancient woodland in the Trent floodplain. So any ideas how much ancient woodland there is remaining in the Trent floodplain? I'll just allow a few moments for you to just post in the chat. Just stick, don't think about it too much. Just think, stick what's in your head. Don't be shy, and hopefully we'll get some pointers. Emma's not going
we've got 50 hectares. We've got 0 hectares. We've got 300 hectares. And another vote. Oh, they're all coming in now. A naughty comment, sweet FA. 2 hectares, 1 hectare, 20 hectares, 3 hectares, 800 hectares for the win. 10 hectares, 15.3 of a hectare. Very specific. 40 hectares, 10.
Okay, that'll do.
225.
Yeah.
0.5% of historic levels. I can go on. A bushel, Steve Arnott, a bushel of.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Not sure how much a bushel is, but not very much, I would wager.
Is there a prize? Ian Diak wants to know.
Yeah. Thanks for that. There isn't a prize other than just the satisfaction of being right, which I'm sure Ian will identify with. Yeah, thanks for that. That's there's a bit of a range there. So if I just show the ancient woodland maps, I'll just move it on a bit. So there you go. Yeah, so it all disappears. There actually, so there is not one scrap of ancient woodland anywhere on the floodplain between Nottingham and the Humber, which is about a distance of 80 miles. So it shows you just how successful we have been at wholesale removal of natural vegetation from floodplains over the last few hundred years, however long it is. So the woodland that does occur is all relatively recent in origin. Some of it's around gravel pits, but those that aren't, those woods are more likely than not to be drained. So although they are on the floodplain, they may not be wet woodland per se. So even in one of our major floodplains, we have very little wet woodland remaining. So I just thought I'd illustrate that. So that raises some questions, doesn't it, as to, what was floodplain woodland like in England, or what could it be like? And to answer that question, we sort of need to go further afield, really. So 2 years ago, I was lucky, almost to the day, actually, 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to be in Slovenia, standing here by the banks of the river Mura. And that year, there'd been catastrophic floods, and the river rose by 10 meters, depositing sediment into the forest, which, should be a regular natural process, really, in these woodlands. It was interesting to see evidence of this with silt deposits through the woodland floor for at least 100 meters or more away from the river. The floodplain forest here is really structurally diverse, and the Slovenian guide I was with was bemoaning the fact that the forest now only extends about 1 kilometer away from both banks from the watercourse. So obviously, in England, we would absolutely kill to have anything like this. So any opportunities to deliver floodplain woodland would be amazing. Obviously, preserved floodplain forest like this is obviously very rare, even in continental Europe. But even the Mura is not a pristine habitat by any means, but what is left is significant. Some stretches are much more modified than others. So the agriculture in this part of Slovenia is much more intensive even than in much of Britain. And as a result, much of the woodland habitat has been lost to agriculture. And in some sections, the banks have been straightened and raised. So not unlike some parts of river systems in our country, really. But then, there are other areas that are much more natural, with extensive oxbows and back channels and beavers and 200 species of birds and all that sort of stuff. So it's a real mixture. And talked about the silt deposition, so you can actually hopefully you can see it here. So you can see the light sandy substrate on the ground. So the silt deposition here after that flood event was about 30 centimeters deep or more, and large hulks of trees had just been shoved into the forest by the river. So the Mura is a low-lying river. A lot of Slovenia is mountainous, but not this particular part. But even so, the energy created during these flood peaks must have been quite significant. And, these floodplain forests are really structurally diverse, with areas of open water, oxbows, scrub, fen, and denser areas of woodland. So, fallen trees and abundant deadwood are common, and it's a real mosaic of open wetland and more wooded areas, which is in constant flux. And, really, this is what we've been missing from the UK, really. And, the question is, can we get things like this back, or do we just not have the space or inclination for it? So the alluvial woods in this part of Slovenia are composed of trees like alder, ash, oak, willows, black and white poplar. So a lot of species which are very familiar to us, but also European white elm, which is the tree here on the screen. So European white elm, Ulmus laevis, is a species that is endemic to floodplains. It's the only elm which is really tolerant of waterlogging. It's not really, doesn't seem very vulnerable to Dutch elm disease. And it is thought to have been native to the UK, certainly in the Thames Valley, but possibly elsewhere. But it's now all but extinct in this country. So, if we are thinking about, restoring natural floodplain woodland, then it would be a very diverse woodland composed of oak, ash, black poplar, willows, elms, alder, birch, lime. So really diverse and wildlife rich. So there is a purpose for showing these pictures of far-flung places. It's not just an opportunity to show you some nice photographs of what we could have had. It's understandable to think that the chance of creating habitats like this in the UK are next to nil. And I think the scope for recreating large-scale floodplain woodland in England is probably limited, but small to medium-scale projects could probably be initiated. And some of those are actually starting to come forward through the landscape recovery scheme now. So it's really, really great to see those sort of like ambitions for, larger scale wet woody habitat creation. So basically, this is a big shout for seeking out those opportunities whenever they arise, really. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I hope that was a useful introduction. I should just say that Forest Research have produced some good guidance around water and woodlands. So go and have a look at those. These are two of those there. We've also got Natural England produced, or English Nation rather, produced the eco-hydrological guidelines for wet woodland a number of years ago. Some of the authors who wrote some of these documents are going to be talking in the next few webinars. So, we've got real experts coming up. And then Alice Milner, who's at Royal Holloway University, in conjunction with others, published a paper about peat forming wet woodlands last year, which is really good. So if you have time, go and have a look at that as well. So we've got all these resources. There will be many more, which we haven't sort of like shared on screen, but hopefully we can do a bit of a roundup afterwards and sort of like provide a more comprehensive list of sources that have been used across the 4 webinars, really. So I'm going to shut up now. You've probably heard enough from me. And I'm going to hand over to Gareth, who's going to be talking about the work that RSPB have been doing around restoring hydrology to drier woodlands. So I'll stop now. Try and stop sharing.
I hope everybody that's coming through okay and people can see that.
It's just loading on my screen. Yep, there it is. I've got it.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. My name's Gareth Fisher. I am an ecologist with the RSPB, and the ecology team provide ecological support and advice to reserve staff, to our conservation officers on habitat management, priority species and their requirements, and conservation management planning and things like that. And amongst other things within the team, I have a focus on woodland habitats and species. The RSPB has over 12,000 hectares of woodland and scrub on its reserves. We do have some full wet woodland on our sites, but today, as Dan said, I'm going to be talking more about restoring hydrology in some of our other more drier woodlands and looking at 3 sites where we've done a bit of work over the last 15 years. So in terms of the issues of woodland drying out, which we have been noticing on some of our sites, and more kind of the drier habitats, as Dan said, the even dry woodlands are likely to have been wetter in the past and will still be affected by drainage and climate change. We don't necessarily think that it's the main driver in terms of the declines of woodland biodiversity across the whole board, but it is definitely likely to be a contributing factor, and especially for some species. Dan mentioned about willow tit previously, but also species like lesser spotted woodpecker, spotted fly, and nightingale. So we know that lesser spotted woodpecker and willow tit definitely like wetter woodland habitats. Species like nightingale in Britain often favour habitat that's in proximity to fresh water and appear to prefer scrubby habitats in damper conditions. The repeat woodland bird survey showed that hawfinch had shown a preference for site wet features, probably needing sort of ponds and things to drink from because they eat a lot of seeds. And they need water to help with the digestion from that perspective, and also a correlation for spot flycatchers, which is likely to be linked to food availability. And then species like woodcock are likely to prefer sites with damp areas, especially if they were needing to probe into soil to find food, and similarly for thrushes. So we think there's links for a wide variety of species. And Dan talked about invertebrates that are specifically linked around sort of woodlands. Obviously, we think about those, but also just generally, if you've got sort of moist, damp soil, it's likely that the insect activity will come quite high up and come out onto the surface. If it's really dry and the soil is really baked, then a lot of species, probably to avoid desiccation, will go further down into the soil column. And from a bird food perspective or an animal food perspective, they'll be less accessible. And then you've also got aquatic invertebrates. So there's been quite a bit of research more recently around the fact that aquatic invertebrates are rich in highly unsaturated fatty acids, and that can be really important for insectivorous species and development of chicks and things like that. So something we're really thinking around, say, for spotted flycatchers. So generally, we're thinking that the drying out of woodland could be limiting the available resources of things that both sort of say decaying wood resources, but also insect abundance or availability. And we've worked on 3 main sites, which are shown by the darker blue dots. So that's Walls Wood in Suffolk, Hynham Woods in Gloucestershire, and Blean Woods in Kent. We also have done a small amount of rewetting work at Stour Estuary, which is the lower of the lighter blue dots, and also on the mid-Yare, sort of Strumpshaw Fen, where they've done a little bit of work to try and impede drainage, and that is more in a full-on wet woodland context. But our 3 main sites, Wolves, Hynham and Blean, they have areas of high forest, but we also have coppice, ride and glade management. And all of them had internal drainage ditches, and some with also perimeter drains as well. And both Woolswood and Hynham had been coppiced in the past. That had faded out, and then we reinstated that management when we took them on. And the drainage ditches either had been or were installed to improve ground conditions to make the management easier. And we actually, the RSPB put in some drainage ditches into Hynham Woods when we acquired it to try and make doing the coppice management and the removal of materials easier. But that was probably in the sort of like the early 80s. So 30 years on, we basically were restoring what we had actually started. But the story really starts in about 2008 when we had a Woodland Wardens gathering, got together a lot of woodland site folk from around the RSPB, and we went to Wolves Wood to have a look at there. And it was noted by the previous warden on the site who'd been there in the 80s that 25 years later, it was seemed much drier, even though we were in late winter. And the current site manager said, well, yes, it does feel like it's got noticeably drier. And also in the 80s, there were a lot of flying insects around, and the site manager basically said, yes, you can pretty much walk around pretty unharassed by sort of biting insects. And we really started to think about the fact, that it seemed to be getting drier, and how that was impacting on the ecology and what we could do about it. And at Wolveswood dams, we put the first dams in 2010, and there was a bit of follow-up work in 2012. And then at Hynham Woods, we did some work in 2014. And in terms of the key bird species for us on both sites, we've got nightingale at both, we've got lesser spotted woodpeckers at both, and we've got spotted flycatchers at both. And we also have those three, or all three of those, at Blean Woods as well. Unfortunately, willow tits have generally, we've lost them from those areas, and their range is contracting north west. So this is Wolveswood, and as you can see, it's surrounded by farmland, and we really realised that basically the internal drains were taking the water to the edge into perimeter ditches, and once it was out of the water, it was very quickly being shifted away down the hill through the farm drains as well. So we started off by looking at creating a map of all the drainage features and the direction in which those flowed, and then created another map which was effectively a plan of the works that we needed, and that was really aiming to minimize losses, water losses from the site, with the fewest number of dams going in. And you can see here a couple of pictures. So we basically created little borrow pits to get clay to create the dams. And then we put right-angle drainage pipes through those. So the water would come up, but once before it reached the level where it might overtop the dam and erode the feature, it would go through hit the top of the drainage pipe and then flow through. So we wouldn't get that erosion issue. And pretty quickly, we saw response once we had some rain that the ditches were filling up. And you can see in that top left image, the water is really up to the level where if it gets any higher, it will start flowing through again, through the sort of the drain pipe. The good thing with this approach in these situations is that you can turn that overflow pipe, so you can turn it down, you can drain the site if you need to get access to carry out work, but then shift it back up. So it's effectively almost working like a mini sort of sluice. So you can raise and lower the levels if you need to. And we monitored how they functioned using these troll data loggers. So these are hydrometric meters that measure the water pressure around them. And we put those into the bottom of the ditches. And you can see a couple of the traces here. So overall, we definitely saw that we were holding water for longer, and it was flattening out the peaks and troughs that we had before we put the dams in. But these are actually a couple of traces from a bit later on. The dams had already been in for a couple of years. And on the left-hand side is a ditch trace. And you can see that through the autumn and the winter, we see the water pressure coming up, and it holds through into from the late 2012 into 2013 at kind of high peak. But in the late summer, we were really seeing it dropping away. And actually, the extent to which it drops off suggests that we maybe had some seepage issues, or the dam wasn't completely sealed, or maybe there was a bit of a crack in the bottom of the ditch, and therefore water was getting out. And that was something we needed to go back and have a look at and see and carry out some work to make sure that it was a bit more watertight. The track on the right hand side is for roughly the same period, but it's actually in an isolated pond, and it's much more stable. But it shows that we are able to hold more water, and we're holding that water at a more steady level. We're never going to completely stop loss of water, obviously, through evapotranspiration. And if it's really dry, we will see features dry out. And that's when there's a risk of cracking either of the dam or through the base of the ditch. But what we're really aiming to do is to just slow the flow and hold water for a longer time through the year. And then these photographs were from Woolswood in 2018. So you can see in the top left-hand corner, there were a lot of chironomid and Daphnia larvae in the ditches during the spring. And through throughout the ditch system, we were seeing a lot of water. And then we were also seeing that some of the ponds that were on site were actually still wet all the way through into September. And I don't know if you remember in 2018, but it was a really hot and dry summer. So the fact that we were actually holding water all the way through a really dry period was really encouraging. And all that potential invertebrate food that will be increasing and more available to species such as spotted flycatchers. It was really encouraging. Then Hynham Woods, as I said, we had actually created some ditches to try and help drain the site to increase the ease of management on site. And we were really wanting to go back and actually stop those up and restore the hydrology. And you can just see a relatively small ditch. Certainly a lot of them were smaller by comparison to Woolswood. But on the left-hand side, you can see one of those small ditches. And then on the right-hand side, you can see there is actually a bit of pooled water. So this was taken after we'd done some of that work and really holding some water back. And we've effectively got a bit of a sedge bed coming through there. And again, we managed to hold water well through the summer, although these pictures are taken, I think, in the sort of winter again. But you can see in both of these pictures, water being held within some of those coppice plots on site, and quite reasonably close, especially in the left-hand picture, to the point at which it's going to flow through that safety pipe to make sure we're not getting erosion of the dam. So at both Hynham and Woolswood, we had seen a decline in the number of nightingales through the 90s and really sort of dropping away. And unfortunately, that mirrored the situation that we're seeing in terms of the national picture of sort of 90+% decline in nightingale numbers and a retraction of their range into the southeast. And so we got down to sort of single figures, but actually at both Woolswood and at Hynham, we did actually see a bit of a response. So following the re-wetting work, we actually saw nightingale numbers increase. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors, so making sure that the habitat structures are right, and the habitat is suitable for them, as well as increasing the dampness and the wetness. But overall, we did actually see a bit of response, as well as with other species. So we also saw some improvements in around the same time for species like dunnock, spotted flycatcher, marsh tit, and song thrush. But unfortunately, not all of those have been sustained, but we don't entirely know why that is. But actually, really interesting thing came out from the work at Hynham and looking at the territories. The red circles were in 2013, and then the dams went in 2014. And the light blue circles were actually numbers in 2017. But we actually saw a number of the territories move towards where we had put dams in. And we also had two territories that were within 100 meters of each other. And we never had that before we did the ditching work. So they were always fairly a little bit more spaced out. So we're looking at that and thinking, well, it looks like they have responded, at least some birds have responded and moved closer to where we have into those habitats where we've done the rewetting. Obviously, hopefully we would be thinking the habitat structure is right for them as well, with that scrubby coppice regen as well. But it definitely seemed like it was having a bit of an impact. But unfortunately, as I said, more recently, nightingale numbers have dropped away, albeit that Hynham is right on the northwest edge of range now in the UK for nightingale. So there's probably a factor that's a factor in how we're seeing the numbers faring more recently. And then moving on to Leanwoods, this project was less about damming ditches. We definitely did have some ditches in there, but relatively small amount compared to the other sites. But it was more, we more thought about uncanalising a river that runs from the south to the north through the reserve, the Sarpen, and that we could see the remnant wiggles still in the ground, but it had definitely been straightened and with the edges really sharp and steep sided. So in 2021, we applied for a Green Recovery Fund project from the government in partnership with Kent Wildlife Trust. And we were successful with that and carried out work at the RSPB's reserve and also in a couple of places on the Kent Wildlife Trust in the Blean complex. I'm only going to really focus on the bit that we did on the RSPB reserve, but we saw some really interesting bog restoration and bits of bog woodland restoration on the Kent Wildlife Trust site as well. And this is one of the sort of like more fine layer sort of leaky dams. I'll just play that. So this video was actually taken in February 2022, and we'd managed to do quite a lot of work. It had actually been a fairly dry winter, which helped us get quite a bit of work done. But before we'd finished, we had some pretty torrential rain for about 5 days, and everything filled up. Frankly, a little bit earlier than we were hoping it would, and to an extent that was much quicker than we thought it might. But it did show that it was holding the water in. We also had some bigger, much larger coarse woody dams, again, not looking to really stopper up the river, but to just slow the flow, hold more water through. And you can see that there. And then we also, as I said, we did a bit of re-meandering, looking at where we could create remove bits of raised up riverbank and sort of allow the water to flow back into the original meanders. And I'll just play this video to show a bit of that. So I think that the main meander off that you can see right at the end there was the really planned bit. The little bit that went off to the right, I think, was not actually anticipated, but when the water levels came up, it just found its own way through, which was, again, really encouraging. And then there's actually a photo taken by one of my colleagues of the same area in April 2023, so a year later. and again showing good levels of that of water coming out of that canalised channel and really finding its way through the woodland habitat. And then this picture, this is actually going back to the summer of 2022, which again, if you remember, was very hot. We hit record temperatures and really dry. And this, and we were really encouraged by this. So this was taken in late June. And you can see that there's water both before and after the dam, and it's really holding the water, holding some water in there. And usually when we go in the summer, especially if it's been dry, there is almost no water coming down through the through this channel. So we're really holding water in way into through the year beyond where it would normally have come since it was canalised. And we were seeing small fish, and we were seeing amphibians in the water, and there were quite a lot of insects flying around over there. So we definitely felt a much generally wetter habitat rather than a very dry one, and that was really encouraging. And then this was these were pictures again in June 2024, and again really encouraging that we're holding water well into the summer. So in terms of our going forward, we obviously need to review sites on a regular basis, repair and enhance where we can. We've definitely seen at Bleanwood the channel being naturalizing itself, eroding bits, but we've also seen some of those dams starting to actually fall apart and decay, and we need to kind of look at how we can repair or enhance those. We really want to better understand the ecological impacts, and we're looking at trying to get a bit of a research project going. Actually, how to do that is proving more thinking than we originally thought in terms of how we measure some of these things. And we're also always looking for new sites where we can do a bit more work. And actually, one of the subsidiary sites to Wolveswood, we did some work this last winter to do some ditch blocking there as well. And then we've got a couple of papers, one in conservation land management, which was produced shortly after we did the initial bit of work at Wolveswood, and then a follow-up in British wildlife. And we do actually have a blog on our website. We did have, I think it might have come off the website, but I can actually probably share that document for it, which talks a bit more about the Blean work. And that was something I think we produced a couple of years ago. And that, I think, is all of my slides. So thank you very much.
Thank you.